Hello, Cindy Odom here. Join me Fridays 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. to hear Celtic and other folk music from Ireland, the British Isles, parts of Europe, and North America. That's on the Celtic Cauldron, 11 to 1 Fridays on KSQD, 90.7 FM, K-Squid, your community radio station.
What if a small group of committed people decided to change the world? That's you and me and KSQD, our new community radio station. Local voices for a change. www.ksqd.org. We are K-Squid, the mighty, the small, the growing community radio station for you and your local issues. Whether it's history, Native voices, or in this case, voices who are objecting to their government's use of tax dollars to bomb other countries. So here we have a guest, Michael Gesser, who is with a number of groups. He is an activist, and he is planning an event up at Lockheed Martin. And let's bring him on the line here. How are you tonight?
I'm a bit anxious about what's happening in the world. But
welcome
that's not
to a
just
large
tonight.
Club, yeah. Yeah. It seems like it's coming from all angles sometimes, doesn't it? There's
one
a lot of wars.
Yeah, a lot of wars, and in particular one that is the focus of the attention of a bunch of us here in Santa Cruz, in the county, on the Central Coast.
And have you been an anti-war protester for a long time in your life?
Well, I've been an anti-militarist protester, let's say. The use of military, U.S. military mainly, and its effect on academia. I was in the university for a long time, and I was interested in kind of exposing all the connections that the military had on campuses where research was being done that was funded by the Department of Defense, and a lot of that is hidden. And so part of what I was interested in was sort of exposing the military-industrial academic complex, because it's bigger than just military-industrial.
So Lockheed funds academic programs at the university?
Oh, well, yes. Also, defense companies do fund lots of research, but even more is funded directly by the Department of Defense or the Navy or the Air Force. Each of these branches of the military has their own research arm that funds research.
And the internet, I understand, came out of one of those programs.
That's true.
So not everything horrible, but lots of pretty sad connections that seem to us to be anathema to freedom and justice and things like that. Lofty ideals that universities sometimes purport to stand for. It's quite a contradiction. It must have been hard to watch the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and come to terms with, how are we going to get out of this without fighting back? Because this is clearly, an incursion into a sovereign nation. I'm sure peace activists looked at that and thought, well, how do we even talk about this how do you push Russia back out if you don't use force? So, yeah.
Well, as your listeners may know, that has been a very divisive topic for the left in general, and for peace activists and other people on the left, with people taking quite polarized sides. And that's not a topic I'd really like to discuss tonight.
No,
Ukraine,
that's okay, but it did come to mind. And, and there's been a lot of, during the moment we're in, while we're watching this very rapidly expanding situation in the Middle East happen, it does, for those of us who are around during 9/11, it's really hard not to remember the anti-war movement that sprung up and was very loud at the beginning. Kind of got drowned out by accusations of anti-patriotism, but were you part of the protest then as well?
I was, and we saw the biggest demonstrations that had ever been held in the history of the world in many cities during that time. And as you all know, in the end, it had no effect whatsoever on what was destined to happen, it seemed. And we seem to be in a moment like that now, too. If you were up at the campus today, you saw yet another local action among, I can think of at least 3 in the last week that attracted hundreds of people in our small town. And we were at one of those in Salinas a few weeks ago. Again, like 100 people on the street with supporters driving by honking. It looks like we're seeing a really worldwide mass movement that disagrees with the leaders that are in charge of the money, as well as the companies that are our main topic for our current focus.
So you have planned an action, direct action. Talk about what you hope to accomplish and what you're going to do. Is obviously not a secret. What you're
It's not a secret. Although I don't really want to talk about that particular action, I want to talk about the sort of somewhat longer-term plans for the group. It's not a direct action. It's really just a picket. But I'm more interested in talking about what our longer-term goals are, because it's really just kind of a first step.
And what group are you speaking of?
We're a new group called Palestine Solidarity Central Coast. People from Santa Cruz and Watsonville with some connections to an allied group in Monterey that has come together around solidarity for the Palestinian struggle against what Amnesty International calls an apartheid state. And we think that that's what we're seeing now. And so we're trying to figure out, what can we do locally to make voices heard in support of this struggle against apartheid. And we're seeing it play out now on our screens in a way that goes beyond anything we've ever seen in this long history of violence. I mean, the history of violence goes back 75 years to the beginning of the State of Israel, but even further if you go back to the beginnings of Zionism. But what we've been seeing in the last month is so extreme it boggles the mind. I mean, we're seeing in an area of land 1/3 the size of Santa Cruz County, with 10 times the population. We're seeing more children killed in that 1 month than in all the conflicts in the world over a year. I mean, think of this, right? We're talking about Ukraine. We're talking about all the different wars that are going on in places like Myanmar and the Congo.
Sudan.
And more children killed in this small space within a month than all over the world in a year in all the different conflicts. We're talking about 99 UN workers killed. We're talking about more than 30 journalists killed. This is the worst year for journalists ever because of this conflict.
In the New York Times today, there was an article discussing how Palestinians have taken to YouTube and, Instagram and TikTok to try to become reporters because, like you said, there are fewer journalists now because they're being killed working there. So, there's people who are untrained to be journalists trying to document what's happening, but they don't have the verification skills. They're just doing raw footage, which can be hard to watch for some people because it's not filtered at all. There's no warning you're about to see gory stuff. So it's just going out, unedited, unfiltered, but it is going out. So there's some glimpse into what's going on there.
Well, our focus is really on what enables this, which is the weapons. I mean, the bottom line is that Israel couldn't be doing this without the most sophisticated weapons in the world, which they have because they're a wealthy country that gets $3.8 billion a year in military aid from the U.S., far beyond, per capita, far beyond what the U.S. gives to any other country.
And what's the package that's proposed to be going up there that's on the table in Congress right now? So there's $3.8 billion a year, but there's this extra package being debated. Do you know how much that's?
I know that $14 billion of that is allocated for Israel. I don't know if that's in addition to the 3.8, but it's a sizable increase over what Israel normally gets that President Biden is now asking for.
The other article today in the New York Times, because I read it a lot in the Washington Post, said time is running out for this war. And I thought that was an interesting framing. And what the reason they thought it was running out was that public opinion around the world was turning against Israel. The more disproportionate this war became, you can argue that anytime some country is struck, they have to do something to defend further damage. But what's harder to argue is the loss of civilian life and how that's been kind of shoved aside by the military people in the Israeli Defense Department.
What you've always seen in the history of Israel is an overwhelmingly disproportionate response to resistance. And there's always resistance when you have a project that's basically a colonial project. That's what this was, a European-based project to colonize a place in the world. And there's always resistance, as there was in other colonial projects in North America, in Algeria, in Kenya. And the resistance has been met with overwhelmingly disproportionate force in all cases. So that, if you tallied up all the people who have died over the years, the number of Palestinians who have died is far greater than the number of Israelis, and that's what we've seen again this time. And so, but again, what we're seeing now seems to go beyond anything that has ever happened before. And so it's hard to know what their thinking is. Do they want to destroy Gaza? Because they have destroyed large parts of Gaza. They're destroying each day. They're destroying multiple houses. They've destroyed half of the hospitals in Gaza.
So you do wonder, since they've evacuated almost all the people from North Gaza to the south, if you've destroyed everyone's home, what will they come back to? And that does beg the question: is there a plan to abscond with that land? Is it really about land ultimately and oil? So, you don't know what the end game, but destroying Hamas seems to be a amorphous goal, just like kill all the, you must remember the war on terror was an amorphous goal, and it could never be proved that we had ever succeed. We killed Osama bin Laden. Did we get all the terrorists in the Middle East? I think this is connected very deeply. The 9/11 story and our two wars can't even be extricated from what's happening right now, simply because the anger against the United States because of our involvement in the Middle East was so, was stirring up people's rage that we became the targets. And I'm worried that we will again now that we're messing around pretty deeply in this. Back to Biden, though, they are pressuring, and they will not use our government so far, including Jimmy Panetta. I'm sorry, Jimmy, but you won't use the word ceasefire, and neither will President Biden. They're calling it humanitarian pauses for 4 hours a day so that people can get out of the way to the south. So there's minor improvements.
And they're bombed as they move to the south as well. Many people.
Well, during this 4 hour pause, they're not supposed to.
No, I mean in the last few weeks, after people had been told to move to the south, there were a number of people killed on those convoys of people moving south.
So. But I would guess that means there's pressure on Biden, that the activists like you and other groups that are protesting are starting to have an impact, and especially the polls of younger voters. Like you said, you saw a big action today at UC Santa Cruz. On the Republican side, you had the debate talking about deporting all of the young voters. That's really going to get your vote. I've never heard of a worse campaign strategy than saying you're...
I hadn't heard of that one.
Yes,
no.
I can't remember if it was Nikki Haley or DeSantis, but they pretty much implied that if you didn't like the way people under 25 voted, you could deport half of them. Great idea. That's going to get a lot of votes. But still, I'm wondering if the young voters are having an effect. Do you think?
I would actually like to sort of shift in a different direction, because our group actually, unlike some others, is not really so interested in pressuring politicians and so on, although we have talked about Panetta, but there doesn't seem to be much hope of winning him over to any kind of position anywhere remotely close to what we're talking about. So we're actually focusing more on other kinds of targets, and in particular the weapons industry, which we have here, right up.
You don't mean literal targets, do you?
We mean targets of demonstrations.
Thank you. I wanted you to clarify
that. Put that in quotations.
Thank you, but no one can see them on the radio.
We're a peaceful group.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
So we have Lockheed Martin, which is by some accounts the largest defense contractor in the world, and I put defense in quotes because defense companies are really mostly not about defense. They're about building weapons that are sold to countries to use for offense as well as defense. So we have Lockheed Martin up the road here, and we have since 1957. They own and use 4,000 acres of the Santa Cruz Mountains for building and testing weapons. And this is just one of hundreds of Lockheed facilities around the world. Not only the country, the world. Lockheed has a facility in Israel.
They're not testing them up there anymore, though.
No, they're not. They used
research?
To. No, they used to. And we used to have a better idea of what they did up there, but they won't tell us anymore. They used to have a web page where they had a nice brochure that showed them testing and claimed, that they were very careful and so on, but they stopped after a while. So to be honest, we don't really know what goes on there. We know that as of last year, they were developing something called the Layered Laser Defense System, along with many other facilities. But beyond that, it's hard to know. And so one of the things that we would like to ask is, as a community, could we know what's happening here in our backyard, in particular as it's related to conflicts all over the world. Lockheed sells weapons to many countries, right, including even both sides in some conflicts. And so Israel is just one of their very big clients.
I understand we not only sell arms to Israel, that's a big lucrative thing, and Saudi Arabia, which has a terrible human rights track record that no one, not Democrats or Republicans, have challenged. In fact, they seem to admire these wealthy oil czars. Not only do we sell, but we apparently buy from Israel as well?
Yes, Israel is one of the world's largest weapons manufacturers as well. It has 3 really significant weapons manufacturers, and they sell weapons all over the world too. I'm not sure they actually sell weapons to the U.S., but I wouldn't be surprised.
I heard someone on the air say it today, but I couldn't tell you where I heard that.
And they work together with Lockheed. So Lockheed collaborates with 2 of these big Israeli companies in the development of weapons. So we're talking about a hand-in-glove kind of relationship.
Well, there's a history of people demonstrating at the source of, militarism. There was, a long history of demonstrating at Livermore Nuclear facility during the 80s when people were worried about the Cold War and us getting blown up by Reagan or Gorbachev at that time. So there were a lot of people going directly, making direct actions down at various military bases. And I can tell you as a resident who lives on the road to Lockheed, they don't have nearly the population of workers that they used to have. That's all I know. Mm-hmm. And I did get to go in there once.
Really?
It was after the fires, and they thanked, some people who had helped out because there's a fire named after them, the Lockheed fire, so we remember
We
that.
should be interviewing you, actually.
It's okay. I don't know much more except one wild story that I won't tell on the air. I'll tell you later. That was more about, no, I'll tell you. It's okay. One of the people that gave us a tour told us that there was a building. They had done some inventory. They didn't know what was up there. Even the people who worked there were not completely aware of what was in every single building. It's a huge, like you said.
How many buildings did you see, out of curiosity?
It looked like a military installation. There were a lot of small wooden buildings in nice repair. But they said they had found a building that had been storing munitions since the 50s. And it was just, they didn't even know how dangerous that was. And they got them out of there. But they said if that had gone off, the whole top of our mountain would have been blown
During
up.
the fires, you mean?
They got it out of there. That's when they evacuated. They were doing a quick inventory because it was coming their way.
Really
and
interesting.
And they got them off of the mountain. But so up until whenever that was, 2008, 2010, anyway, they had...
Oh, you mean an earlier fire? You don't mean the 2020, the
There
CZU.
was the Martin fire.
Oh, okay.
Which
so
was in
I wasn't
2008.
here. Yeah.
There was the Lockheed fire, which is...
The Lockheed fire.
2009 or 10, and then there was CZU in 2020. So there was, up until that time, I know there was definitely some munitions stored there, which they didn't even know.
That is really interesting.
Isn't that scary?
Yeah, that's scarier even than us not knowing.
Yeah.
They don't know.
That they didn't know.
Right.
And that once they knew, they freaked out and got them out of there. Thank you.
Well, now there's, we know that there were demonstrations there in the 80s, and as recently as 2006, there were demonstrations there on Hiroshima Day in 2004. There was a group in 2004 called the Santa Cruz Weapons Inspection Team, SQIT, which went up there.
Almost like Squid.
I don't think they got in, but they tried to.
They stayed at the gate. Yeah, there's heavy security there.
There is.
So and also it's so far away from everything
Right.
in Santa Cruz County that the press doesn't like to drive up there. So if you're trying to get attention, it's hard. I remember, a few times when there was an action there and the press didn't come.
Really? Well, let's hope
it's 25. Well, it's 20
18
miles. 18 miles from
18
Santa
miles.
Cruz.
I went up the other day to.
So if you just joined me, I'm speaking with Michael Gusser. He is part of a group that is protesting the militarization of what's happening in the Middle East and the role of military suppliers, such as Lockheed, in the process of arming Israel. Anything else you would like to say? We have 10 more minutes. I thought we would talk some more about protest and what it does and doesn't do for public opinion.
Well, one of the things that happens is that there are these calls that happen, right? So in this case, this week, an association of Palestinian labor unions and professional associations called the Workers in Palestine made a call to the world, basically, to stop the weapons flow. That's their focus this week. And what happened was, not so much protest, but trade unions around the world agreeing, all right, well, we're not going to load them here. So here in Spain, we're going to stop them when they come. Here in southern India, we're going to stop. So this is small,
These are dock
but it's
workers
significant.
or people?
Yes, dock
Yeah.
workers basically for the most part. And they tend to be, as you may know, dock workers tend to be, at least in this country, relatively radical kinds of workers who are more willing to go along with this kind of call, typically, than other workers. So it's about demonstrating, but it's also about actually holding the line and not letting things go through, as happened, right, during previous conflicts. We had people, standing in the way of weapons trains during the 80s, and even local people losing limbs as a result.
That's right.
So,
we did have that story here in Santa Cruz, and people putting their bodies on the line for what they believe in. Once things get morally impossible for them to ignore, they have often put their bodies on the line. There's a long history of nonviolent civil disobedience, going back to before the civil rights movement. But that's kind of the pivotal moment when it was used quite a lot.
Yeah.
And you're talking about that being revived again.
I think we'll see it. I mean, we are seeing massive demonstrations all over the world in places where you wouldn't expect it. In Senegal, we're seeing demonstrations, besides London and Berlin and Paris and Washington and San Francisco last weekend. And they are overwhelmingly peaceful. I mean, and when you see direct actions, it's people sitting in the offices of Congress people, or sitting in front of one of these weapons manufacturers' offices. Today, in front of Nancy Pelosi's office in where was it? In San Francisco, maybe. People were blockading the door,
right.
Peacefully blockading the door.
So they're throwing themselves on the machinery and trying to stop it, and that's what they did today effectively at UC Santa Cruz. The entrance to the campus was shut down for a number of hours. Some of us who teach there had their classes outside, so they didn't have to cross the picket line. So some people made it a teachable moment to try to get their students to at least learn about the different histories and conflict there, because it's not an easy, simple story. It depends on how far back you go. And I will say, scrawled on the side of one of the buildings on my way in yesterday, I should say, at UC Santa Cruz was, please respect Jewish students. There's a lot of students on campus that feel unheard and threatened by this. They're not necessarily pro-Israel in any way, but they're feeling like there's a fine line between being pro-Palestine and being anti-Semitic. And it's a very thin line. There's a long history there, too. And I will say that the biggest number of hate crimes that have happened in this country, surprisingly to some, are against Jewish people in the past year or two. They've just spiked. And so have attacks on people who are Muslim as well. Both sides have seen this spike in our country. One guy at a protest, a Jewish man, was killed. So we need to be careful not to let it divide us here.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm going to say something controversial, and that is, to the extent that the Zionist project, is to associate all Jews with Israel, that becomes the association of Jews with the policies of Israel.
But
and
Jews aren't all associated with Israel.
That's right, but that's what Zionism would like to do. I mean, that's what
whether it would like to or not, people have their own free will. And
I know.
There is a large and vocal community of Jewish people in this country and in Israel, by the way, who do not agree with Netanyahu's policies at all. And
I work with them.
And in fact, he, I think, could lose his position over this. Well, first of all, over not bringing the hostages home with any speed. He doesn't seem to care about them. He's just going to go bomb the tunnels where they're keeping them.
No, I think some have already been killed in this process. Yeah.
And I think he's going to lose his job over
not
I would
bringing
them
so.
home. That I think more people there. They're still burying their dead there. They're still having funerals, and there's still 200 people missing from people's lives, and they're terrified what's going to happen.
And the families are demonstrating every day in Tel Aviv. Yeah.
The most gripping story I have heard in this, and there's so many, was from a gentleman who lived in one of the kibbutzes. His family, a lot of them were killed, some were kidnapped, and he escaped, and he regrouped, and he kept doing what he was doing, which was ferrying Palestinians to Israeli hospitals who were injured or who needed dialysis. That was his role. He was going to make peace through his actions, and he wasn't going to be dissuaded, by what happened. And that showed more than just turning the other cheek. It showed a huge amount of humanity from this person who could have turned his personal family tragedy into revenge, but he didn't.
No, I've heard of other families of people who were killed on October 7th who are really arguing against the current policy, the current, basically genocidal policy in Gaza. This is genocidal. And
conversely, you have people who are Palestinian in the Arab world, or just Arabs in general, trying to speak out against Hamas, and they are silenced. It's almost like two mirror images of the same thing. Like, freedom of speech is one of the big casualties of this situation, I think, when people can't even talk about what's happening because they'll be labeled anti-Arab if you're anti-Hamas.
Yes.
It's the same thing over on this side. And it's not helping dialogue or advancing what needs to happen, which is, the reality is, Biden has the power to call for a ceasefire and to stop all weapons if they don't do it.
Right. No, Biden has...
he has a huge amount of power.
Huge power, and is not using it for...
But he will use it if he gets enough pressure and feels like it's going to cost him the re-election.
It's useful to remember Biden's quote from years ago in his speech to Congress: "If Israel didn't exist, we would have to invent it because it's so useful. Such a great investment for the United States." That's the way Biden has always seen Israel.
And I doubt anyone in Israel would like to think of themselves as a strategic oil depot, but
a great investment.
Yes, I don't think anyone wants to think of their homeland as an investment or an oil depot. So we'll have to leave it there on that note. Thank you for coming by and sharing. Do you want the public to contact you if they are interested more? How would they do that?
We have an email, which is Palestinian Solidarity CC at proton.me. Palestinian Solidarity CC at proton.me. That would be the best way.
All right. I've been speaking with Michael Gesser. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
This is K-Squid, KSQD, Santa Cruz, and remind you that the views expressed on this program do not reflect the staff, volunteers, or board of Natural Bridges Media or K-Squid. Coming up next, it's First Person Singular, and that'll be followed by all kinds of great programming. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman. This is KSQD, Santa Cruz, KSQT, Prunedale.